Over the course of many years, I have written a number of books. Throughout them, I have returned again and again to one central idea. The mind works like a computer. I call this view the Computational Theory of Mind, or CTM. In my opinion, it remains the most powerful framework we have for thinking about thought itself. There are certain facts about the mind that are simply impossible to understand without it. The core idea is elegant. Thinking is, in an important sense, a mechanical process. That insight captures a significant part of the truth. What I never expected, however, was that some people would mistake it for the whole truth. Yet many have. Some researchers believe that the mind is nothing more than a machine. This view is especially common among those who attempt to build artificial minds, what we now call artificial intelligence. But constructing artificial minds is fundamentally an engineering project. It is not, by itself, a science of the mind. Whenever I wrote about CTM, I tried to make one thing absolutely clear. It is only a small part of a much larger story. It does not answer the deepest questions about thinking. I assumed this point was uncontroversial. I believed we all agreed on it. I was mistaken. A few years ago, I read two books that forced me to reconsider that assumption. One was written by Steven Pinker, and the other by Henry Plotkin. Both argued that the human mind is fundamentally mechanical and that we are born with a substantial amount of information already built in. They linked these claims to evolutionary theory and seemed confident that they had discovered the blueprint of the mind itself. I admired both books, but I was not persuaded by all of their conclusions. My concerns were several. First, they never adequately explained how the various pieces of their theory fit together. Second, Noam Chomsky, one of the most influential thinkers in the field, does not fully agree with their position. Third, they connect the mind to biology in ways that I find unconvincing. And finally, Pinker strikes me as far too optimistic. Over the last 50 years, we have learned something important about the mind. Some mental processes are extraordinarily complex. In many of these areas, the computational approach simply does not work very well. This is widely recognized. Given that fact, I find it difficult to understand such confidence. That is why I wrote this book. My goal was to push some older ideas a little further. This book is shorter than Pinker's, and perhaps a bit more critical. I do not intend to start from the beginning and explain every concept from scratch. Instead, I want to offer a different perspective. My conclusion is straightforward. The computational approach is valuable, but it is not the whole truth. When I began writing, I intended to focus primarily on innate knowledge, on what philosophers call nativism. Before long, however, I realized that everything is connected. One question inevitably leads to another. Is the mind really a computer? Before anything else, we must answer that question. About half a century ago, a remarkable intellectual project began. One of its central figures was Alan Turing. Turing proposed that thinking resembles a language. Just as larger sentences are built from smaller words, larger thoughts are built from smaller thoughts. Inside the mind, these operations unfold through computation, a process that can be understood mechanically. I believe Turing was largely correct. Thinking does resemble a language, but treating thought as nothing more than a machine gives us only half the story. For decades, researchers questioned nature, and nature answered back. Those answers have taught us a great deal about how far the computational approach can take us, and where its limits begin. Before we go further, let me briefly summarize the situation. The mind contains two broad kinds of contents. On one side are our beliefs and desires. On the other are our feelings and experiences. Likewise, there appear to be two very different ways in which the mind operates. The first is local. The second is global. Local processes are small, specialized, and compartmentalized. They function very much like computers. In many cases, they appear to be innate, built into us from birth. Global processes are another matter entirely. They do not resemble local processes at all. That is one reason we understand them so poorly. The most fascinating features of the human mind belong to this global side of cognition, and yet it is precisely this aspect that remains the most mysterious. For that reason, I am not particularly optimistic. The science of the mind is still in its early stages. We have made progress, but we remain far from a complete understanding. The tools we possess today are not yet equal to the task. As yours donkey once remarked, "It is snowing and it is bitterly cold. Thank goodness there hasn't been an earthquake." The joke captures something important. Sometimes we celebrate the absence of one disaster while ignoring another problem entirely. In the chapters that follow, we will begin with innate knowledge. Pinker and Plotkin differ significantly from Chomsky, even when they appear to be using the same vocabulary. Chomsky is primarily interested in how knowledge is acquired. Others are more interested in the mechanisms of thought itself. Readers familiar with these debates may already know this. What often goes missing, however, is Turing's contribution. Without the computational story, the entire picture remains incomplete. A theory of mind without computation is rather like a wedding without a groom. I intend to put that missing piece back into the picture. Doing so will make the story more complicated. But truth is more important than simplicity. From there, we will examine the weaknesses of the theory itself. We will revisit several older approaches and explore why they failed. We will then turn to modularity, a newer and highly influential idea, and examine its shortcomings as well. Finally, we will return to some of the oldest questions. My suspicion is that Chomsky may ultimately be closer to the truth than many of his critics believe. Even so, his account remains incomplete. The newer alternatives may prove mistaken in the end. Understanding the mind is not easy. I have believed that for many years, and nothing has happened to change my mind. My views have remained remarkably stable. I am simply trying to find the right path forward. So let us begin. My name is Rohit, and you are listening to Syllabus with Rohit. Modern discussions of these issues begin with Chomsky. Chomsky made two extraordinarily important claims. First, every human language operates according to a set of underlying rules. These rules are universal. They appear across languages all over the world. Second, these rules are already present within the human mind. We are born with them. They are built into the very structure of our cognitive system. Chomsky defended this view in two different ways. The first approach is comparative. Examine all the languages of the world and identify what they have in common. Whatever appears everywhere is likely to reveal part of the underlying structure. The second approach focuses on children. Children learn language with astonishing speed. The people around them provide surprisingly little explicit instruction, yet language acquisition proceeds rapidly and reliably. The obvious conclusion is that much of the necessary information was already present within the child. That built-in knowledge makes language learning possible. It also helps explain the difference between humans and other animals. Human children acquire language naturally. Monkeys and other animals do not. The theory sounds simple enough. Proving it, however, is extraordinarily difficult. Scientists struggle to obtain funding. Experts disagree fiercely. Some claim that language emerges from society. Others argue that it develops from practical needs. Despite these criticisms, Chomsky has remained remarkably consistent. In many respects, his view is not new at all. Long before Chomsky, Plato suggested something similar. Just as we seem to possess an innate grasp of geometry, Plato believed that we also possess an innate grasp of language. Seen in that light, Chomsky is not inventing an entirely new idea. He is giving an ancient idea a modern form. Let us now turn to Pinker and Plotkin. Although they share certain assumptions with Chomsky, their emphasis is different. Chomsky focuses on knowledge, what we know and how we come to know it. Pinker and Plotkin are more interested in the mechanisms of thought itself. Their central idea belongs to a tradition that began with Alan Turing and eventually became known as the computational approach. At its core lies a simple proposal: the mind is a machine. To understand what that means, consider a very simple example. Suppose I say, Shiv is studying, and evening has arrived. This sentence contains two separate claims. If the entire sentence is true, then one part of it must also be true. Shiv is studying. Notice something important. You do not need to know who Shiv is in order to draw that conclusion. You do not need any information about his life, his personality, or his circumstances. All you need is the structure of the sentence. That insight lies at the heart of Turing's achievement. Machines do not understand meaning. They know nothing about the world itself. What they can understand is structure. what linguists call syntax. A machine can examine the arrangement of symbols and perform operations on them with extraordinary speed. According to the computational theory of mind, human thinking works in much the same way. Thinking is a form of computation. The mind continuously connects one truth to another, generating new conclusions from existing representations. At first glance, this seems like an elegant solution. The idea also fits naturally with a broader rationalist tradition. According to that tradition, we are born with certain mental tools already in place. These tools are inherited. They are part of our cognitive endowment. Earlier thinkers often described them as built-in mechanisms, natural machines designed to process information in specific ways. The crucial point is this: every belief, desire, and thought possesses a structure. That structure determines what the mind can do with it. Consider another example. Suppose we say, Rohan is swimming and Seema is drinking. Because the word enjoins two claims together, we can immediately infer that Rohan is swimming. The conclusion follows automatically from the structure. Now consider a different example. Ghosts do not exist. This is a negative statement. Because of its form, we can immediately infer that your friend is not a ghost. Again, the reasoning depends on structure rather than content. The lesson is straightforward. Every thought has a form. The mind operates on that form. Several additional consequences follow from this idea. First, every thought possesses a definite structure. If two thoughts have different structures, then they are different thoughts, even if they happen to express very similar meanings. Conversely, two thoughts may have the same structure while expressing completely different content. For example, Santa Claus does not exist, and fairies do not exist. These statements concern different subjects, but they share the same logical form. Another important point is that thoughts are composed of smaller elements. Take the statement, Akash is bald. Part of the thought concerns Akash. Another part concerns baldness. These components are what philosophers often call concepts. Some theories claim that thinking is nothing more than association. One idea triggers another. Tea reminds us of biscuits. One memory leads to the next. But human thought cannot be reduced to simple chains of association. It follows rules. It possesses structure. That is why we can revise our beliefs. Imagine that I am completely convinced that Rohan is bald, while you are only mildly persuaded. The belief matters greatly to me and very little to you. Yet the structure of our thoughts remains identical. Our attitudes differ. The form of the thought does not. The obvious question, then, is this: how does structure actually influence thought? Earlier philosophers struggled to answer that question. The arrival of computers changed everything. According to the computational approach, every thought corresponds to a mental representation, a kind of internal symbol. These representations stand for things in the world. They are the objects upon which cognition operates. Just as a computer manipulates symbols, the mind manipulates representations. Importantly, it does not need to understand their meaning directly. It responds to their syntax. A computer processes zeros and ones. The mind processes representations. Earlier theories of thought relied heavily on association. Ideas became linked simply because they occurred together repeatedly. Turing introduced something radically different. He demonstrated that machines could follow formal rules. The mind, he suggested, might operate according to rules as well. This is one of the most remarkable features of cognition. One truth can lead systematically to another. No magic is required. No mysterious force is necessary. The process is computational. And it is precisely this process that we are trying to understand. At this point, two traditions come together. The rationalist tradition contributes innate structure and built-in mental tools. Turing contributes computation. Together, they form what we call the computational theory of mind. The theory rests on three central principles. First, thoughts function because of their logical structure. Second, that structure is embodied in mental representations. Third, thinking itself is a computational process. Taken together, these principles answer two fundamental questions. How does thought acquire its structure? And how does that structure influence mental activity? The answer is elegant. Mental syntax determines the structure of thought. That same syntax also determines how thoughts interact with one another. For the first time, we appear to have a picture of thinking that is both rational and mechanical. The mind can be understood as a machine without sacrificing reason. That is a profoundly attractive idea. In many ways, it is one of the most beautiful ideas in modern cognitive science. At this stage, half of the modern synthesis is complete. We are born with substantial cognitive structure already in place, and our minds operate according to computational principles. Together, these claims form the foundation of the new synthesis. Many theorists, however, want to go further. They argue that the mind is divided into specialized compartments, or modules, and that these modules are themselves products of evolution. It is here that I believe serious mistakes begin to appear. Before we examine those mistakes, however, we must first understand a concept that lies at the center of the entire discussion. That concept is syntax. Syntax may be the most important feature of the computational view, but what exactly is it? In one sense, syntax is remarkably simple. It concerns only the internal arrangement of symbols. It deals with local properties. Think about the spelling of a word. You do not need to know anything about the outside world in order to examine its spelling. The information is contained entirely within the word itself. Syntax works in much the same way. Yet syntax possesses a remarkable power. Although it is local, it allows us to make claims about things beyond itself. It connects internal structure to external reasoning. Consider the sentence, Shiv swims. Here, Shiv functions as a name, while swims functions as an action. That relationship belongs to the syntax of the sentence. From that structure, we can immediately generate a sensible question. Who swims? A machine that understands the structure can produce that question automatically. The same principle applies in logic. If the statement Shiv swims is true, then the statement someone swims must also be true. A machine can derive that conclusion without knowing anything whatsoever about Shiv. It needs only the syntax. One of the most fascinating aspects of computation is that meaning becomes unnecessary. Structure alone is sufficient. A simple example from nature may help clarify the point. In certain species of fish, an excited male develops a bright red marking on its body. Other males see the red marking and respond aggressively. The excitement itself is internal. The red mark is external. The other fish respond to the sign and infer what it represents. In that sense, the sign functions like a representation. Yet there is an important difference between signs in nature and thoughts in the mind. Changing the fish's color does not change the fish itself. Changing the syntax of a thought changes the thought. Remove Shiv from the thought Shiv is bald, and it is no longer the same thought. Its identity depends on its structure. So far, then, we have learned three things. We possess a significant amount of innate knowledge. The mind has a computational architecture, and thinking itself is a form of computation. But Turing and Chomsky have given us only half the story. The other half concerns modules, the supposedly separate compartments of the mind. Many theorists argue that the mind is divided into numerous specialized systems, each shaped by evolution for a particular purpose. Soon, we will see why this idea is both attractive and problematic. The computational approach works beautifully for small, local tasks. Its difficulties emerge when we move beyond those boundaries. And that, perhaps, is the deepest weakness in the entire science of the mind. We have seen that syntax plays a central role in the computational theory of mind. Change the syntax, and you change the thought itself. Behind this idea lies an important principle. Only essential properties influence mental processes. Syntax is one such property. It remains stable regardless of circumstance or context. A computer operates entirely by examining these stable structures. And this is exactly where the real trouble begins. Much of human thinking depends on context. Computers, however, have no genuine understanding of context. Consider the idea of simplicity. Human beings naturally prefer simple explanations and efficient solutions. In many situations, that preference is a mark of intelligence. But what does simplicity mean to a machine? A computer might conclude that shorter sentences are simpler than longer ones. For example, the cat is on the computer. This sentence is short. Now compare it with, the cat is sleeping on the computer. This one is slightly longer. A machine that relies only on syntax might treat the first sentence as simpler. But real-world simplicity does not work that way. Its meaning depends on context. The very same piece of information can be important in one situation and irrelevant in another. Imagine that you plan to sail a boat tomorrow. Then you discover that there will be no wind. Suddenly, your entire plan becomes much more complicated. The absence of wind is highly relevant. Now imagine that you plan to travel by car instead. In that case, the lack of wind makes almost no difference at all. The information is exactly the same. There will be no wind tomorrow. Its syntax has not changed, yet its significance changes dramatically depending on the situation. In one context, it matters enormously. In another, it barely matters at all. A computer sees only the sentence. It sees only the syntax. It does not see the circumstances in which the information is being used. For this reason, simplicity cannot be understood solely in syntactic terms, and that is one reason why the equation of mind and computer remains incomplete. Computers excel at formal reasoning. They perform extraordinarily well when problems can be reduced to local structures and explicit rules. But many forms of human thought operate on a larger scale. These are what I call global processes, and it is here that the computational approach begins to struggle. The significance of a belief often depends upon its relationship to countless other beliefs. Meaning changes with context. Importance changes with context. Relevance changes with context. Computers, however, have no clear way of representing these relationships. At first glance, this may seem to suggest that thinking and computation are entirely different things. The situation is actually more subtle. When people claim that the mind is a computer, they may mean one of two different things. The first interpretation is strict. According to this view, cognition depends entirely on local syntax. The mind examines only the internal structure of representations. As we have already seen, that picture cannot adequately explain global thought. The second interpretation is more flexible. According to this version, the mind may respond to any kind of structure, including structures that involve context and relationships between beliefs. Under this broader interpretation, perhaps even simplicity could be treated as a computational principle. If that were true, then global thought might still be understood computationally. Unfortunately, a deeper problem emerges. To determine the significance of a particular belief, a machine would need to compare that belief with an enormous body of background information. Imagine a small piece of information. Call it R. Now imagine that R exists within a much larger system of beliefs. Call that system T. To understand the significance of R, the machine must evaluate R in relation to T. In effect, it must examine the entire system. That means processing an immense amount of information simultaneously. Human beings do not think that way. Our knowledge systems are simply too large. Consider a familiar example. Dark clouds appear in the sky, and you are trying to decide whether to take an umbrella. You look at the clouds and make a decision. You do not review every memory from childhood. You do not consult every book you have ever read. You do not revisit every belief you have ever formed. You focus only on what seems relevant. If the mind operated like a strict computational system, it would have to search through the entire network of knowledge. That would be impossible. The burden would be overwhelming. Human beings do not reason by consulting everything they know. They reason selectively. Even powerful computers struggle when asked to evaluate massive systems all at once. Some philosophers have argued that every belief is connected to every other belief. Perhaps they are right. But if every act of reasoning required us to examine the entire structure of knowledge, thinking would become impossibly slow. This is one of the places where the computational approach begins to break down. Most of the time, we need only a small amount of information. Suppose I say, "This mango is sweet." That is a simple claim. But whether that claim matters, and how much it matters, depends on countless other factors. Those relationships are not determined by syntax. They are determined by the structure of reality itself. And that is precisely where older computational theories encounter difficulty. They cannot adequately explain global cognition. Being a machine is not enough. The real mystery is understanding how minds actually work. Everyone recognizes that there is a problem here. Machines seem to require access to everything. Human beings do not. At this point, we begin moving toward a different way of thinking about cognition, one that eventually leads to the idea of massive modularity. Before we get there, however, consider another example. Human beings generally prefer to preserve their existing beliefs. We do not abandon our convictions lightly. In many situations, that is a sign of rationality. Without a compelling reason, we prefer to keep our beliefs intact. Computers encounter difficulties here as well. Changing a belief carries consequences. Some beliefs occupy a central place within our understanding of the world. If those beliefs change, many others must change along with them. But which beliefs are central? That depends on context. It depends on theory. Consider a historical example. For centuries, scientists believed that heavy objects fall faster than light ones. The idea seemed obvious. A stone falls quickly. A feather falls slowly. The belief appeared fundamental. Then scientists discovered the role of air resistance. The supposedly fundamental principle turned out to be false. Once the theory changed, the importance of the original belief disappeared. Now, consider another example. People once assumed that metals must always be solid. Mercury is liquid. Therefore, many concluded that mercury could not be a metal. Later, they learned that metals can exist in liquid form. Once again, a change in theory transformed what seemed essential. The lesson is important. What counts as central changes over time. Syntax does not. Syntax has no way of determining which beliefs matter most. It simply operates according to formal rules. So how does the mind determine importance? Computational theories offer no satisfying answer. This is one of the major weaknesses in the modern picture. In response, many theorists propose a solution. They argue that the mind is divided into separate compartments, modules. The hope is that modularity will eliminate the need for global reasoning. But this is not merely an abstract philosophical debate. It creates a serious challenge for cognitive science itself. If the computational picture were entirely correct, we should understand the mind far better than we currently do. The truth is that the theory continues to encounter failure. It works remarkably well in some situations. It performs poorly in others. Artificial intelligence provides a useful example. Despite decades of progress, machines still struggle with tasks that human beings perform effortlessly. This remains a striking limitation. We still cannot build a household robot that reliably prepares breakfast in an ordinary kitchen without difficulty. Machine translation remains imperfect. Automatic summarization remains unreliable. Many everyday tasks that children perform with ease continue to challenge our most advanced systems. Yet some theorists write as though the mysteries of the mind have already been solved. If that were true, our machines would be far more capable than they are. The reason for their limitations becomes clear once we recognize the importance of context. Ordinary reasoning depends upon contextual understanding, and that creates a profound dilemma. To reach the best conclusion, a system would need access to enormous amounts of information. To act efficiently, however, it must examine only a small fraction of that information. A machine has no obvious way of deciding what matters and what does not. This difficulty is known as the frame problem. It remains one of the most persistent challenges in artificial intelligence. Computers perform brilliantly when reasoning is local. For example, Shiv and Mohan arrived. From that statement, a machine can immediately infer Shiv arrived. All it needs is syntax. The task is local, clear, and computationally manageable. But ordinary life is not like that. Most real-world reasoning depends on context, and computers possess no reliable method for handling context. As a result, they often become overwhelmed by the very information they need to process. That is why machines still struggle with tasks that young children perform naturally. If everything we have discussed so far is correct, then a significant crack runs through the foundations of modern cognitive science. At this point, you may wonder why researchers are not more alarmed. Why do so many continue to place their faith in computational explanations? There are two main reasons. Some hope that the problem can be solved through shortcuts, what psychologists call heuristics. Others place their confidence in connectionist models and neural networks. They believe these approaches will eventually overcome the limitations of traditional computation. I am not so sure. The problem is deeper than many people realize. Global cognition remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in the science of the mind. And at present, we seem no closer to solving it than before. Let us begin with the first proposed solution, heuristics. It is certainly true that human beings do not always reason perfectly. We rarely analyze every problem in exhaustive detail. Instead, we rely on approximations, rules of thumb, and practical shortcuts. This observation has led some researchers to suggest that perhaps the mind avoids global reasoning altogether. Maybe what appears to be sophisticated thought is really just the use of many small heuristics. Artificial intelligence researchers often approach the frame problem in precisely this way. They argue that large problems can be broken into smaller pieces and solved through efficient shortcuts. At first glance, the proposal seems sensible. Unfortunately, it faces a serious difficulty. How do we decide which shortcut to use? That decision is itself a form of reasoning. Imagine that you are considering investing money in a potato business. The decision is complicated. To simplify matters, you decide to use a shortcut. Perhaps you consult a friend. Perhaps you read a newspaper. Perhaps you ask an expert. But now, a new question appears. Should you trust the source? That question depends entirely on context. If your friend happens to be a successful potato entrepreneur, his advice may be valuable. If he is simply an ordinary neighbor with no relevant experience, his opinion may be worthless. Notice what has happened. Even selecting a shortcut requires contextual reasoning. The very problem we hope to avoid has quietly returned. We find ourselves caught in a circle. The solution depends upon the variability it was supposed to explain. At this point, it is useful to distinguish between two different aspects of cognition. The first is computational. This involves moving from one thought to another through formal operations and logical rules. A simple mathematical equation illustrates the idea: 2 + 2 = 4. The second aspect is architectural. This concerns the structure of the mind itself, the way cognition is organized before any particular reasoning takes place. Computers excel at the first kind of activity. They manipulate symbols with extraordinary precision. What they do not do well is grasp an entire context simultaneously. Turing's machine operates locally. It can inspect one representation at a time. It can follow one rule after another. What it cannot do is evaluate an entire system of beliefs all at once. It does not know which facts are ordinary and which are important. It does not know which assumptions should be abandoned and which should be preserved. And that brings us back to the central puzzle. How does the human mind understand context so effortlessly? The computational theory provides no satisfying answer. It excels at small, isolated operations. Its difficulties emerge when we move beyond them. Consider a simple analogy. We can understand what time it is by consulting a clock. A clock is a machine designed for a very specific purpose. It performs that task beautifully. But there is no comparable machine for global cognition. There is no device that automatically determines the relevance of everything we know. There is no machine that can instantly decide which belief matters most in a particular situation. This is why the computational approach begins to falter. By now, we have accepted two important conclusions. First, global effects in thought are real. Second, Turing's model does not seem capable of explaining them. Perhaps future discoveries will show that global cognition is computational after all. Perhaps some deeper theory will emerge. At present, however, we possess no convincing evidence for such a theory. Turing's framework remains extraordinarily powerful when applied to local reasoning. Its limitations become visible only when we move to larger scales. If one believes that global cognition is unimportant, then Turing's story may appear complete. I do not share that belief. Global cognition lies at the very heart of intelligent thought, and until we understand it, our theories will remain incomplete. The mind is not merely a machine manipulating syntax. Let us now consider another proposed solution. This approach is known as connectionism, sometimes called network theory. To be perfectly honest, I find it even less persuasive than the traditional computational model. It struggles with logic. It struggles with global reasoning. And despite its popularity, I have never found its explanatory power particularly convincing. So what exactly is a connectionist network? Unlike an ordinary computer, a connectionist system does not clearly separate memory from processing. Instead, it consists of large numbers of simple units connected together. You can think of them as switches linked by countless pathways. When one switch becomes active, it influences the activity of others. The process resembles an old psychological idea known as associationism. One thought activates another. One memory triggers the next. Thinking becomes a pattern spreading through a network. When we perceive something through our senses, the network responds. What we think depends partly on what we encounter in the world and partly on the strengths of the connections already present within the system. The idea is attractive because it appears simple. But simplicity is not always a virtue. Connectionist models face a serious problem. Within a network, a node derives its identity from its position. A node means what it means because of its relationships to other nodes. It possesses no independent identity of its own. As a result, moving a node changes its role. And changing its role changes the thought itself. This creates difficulties when we try to represent structure. Consider two sentences: Ram hit Shyam, and Shyam hit Ram. The words are the same. The structure is different. The meaning changes completely. Yet connectionist systems often struggle to represent such distinctions cleanly. They do not naturally capture syntax. And syntax, as we have already seen, is central to cognition. The difficulties do not end there. Connectionist models face many of the same problems as traditional computational theories. They still struggle with global thought. They still struggle with context. They still struggle with relevance. A network does not automatically know which beliefs matter most. Its connections reflect past learning. They do not instantly reorganize themselves to accommodate changing circumstances. Yet human cognition does exactly that. A belief that seems crucial today may become irrelevant tomorrow. An assumption that once appeared central may later prove insignificant. Human beings adapt to such changes with remarkable flexibility. Networks do not. For this reason, connectionism fails to provide a satisfactory account of global cognition. Where does that leave us? One possibility is to wait patiently for better ideas. That may sound appealing, but it is not a solution. Another possibility is to deny that global cognition exists. But that would simply ignore the evidence. We have now seen that globality remains a thorn in the side of computational theories. Yet another possibility remains. Perhaps the mind consists of many specialized compartments, what psychologists call modules. If each module performs only local operations, then perhaps the computational approach can succeed after all. This leads us to three possibilities. First, perhaps the mind contains no modules whatsoever. If that is true, the modular theory collapses immediately. Second, perhaps only some parts of the mind are modular. In that case, we should focus our attention on those specific systems. Third, perhaps the entire mind is modular. Perhaps cognition consists entirely of specialized processing units. This view is known as massive modularity. If massive modularity is correct, then thinkers such as Pinker and Plotkin may be right, and many of my objections would lose their force. I do not believe that is the case. In fact, I believe massive modularity creates more problems than it solves. Before we can evaluate that claim, however, we must first understand what a module actually is. The term is surprisingly ambiguous. Different researchers use it in different ways. Broadly speaking, there are two kinds of mental architecture. One involves informationally closed systems. The other does not. For now, we will focus on the closed variety. Some researchers call any specialized mental component a module. Under that definition, every organ in the body could qualify as a module because every organ performs a specialized function. If that is what modularity means, then almost everyone would agree that the mind is modular. Chomsky uses the concept somewhat differently. For him, a module is primarily a repository of innate knowledge, a built-in database dedicated to a particular domain. My own definition is narrower. I will use the term module to mean a closed cognitive machine. A module performs its work without consulting information outside itself. It relies exclusively on the resources contained within its own boundaries. That restriction explains why modules are attractive. Because they ignore most information, they can operate extremely quickly. The mind does not need to search the entire world. It searches only a small and specialized database. In principle, this solves the frame problem. The module simply ignores everything outside its domain. Viewed in this way, the appeal of modularity becomes obvious. Computers perform best in local environments. Modules create local environments. The computational theory, therefore, fits naturally with modular explanations. But what happens if we push the idea to its limit? Suppose there are not merely a few modules. Suppose there are thousands. Suppose the entire mind consists of nothing but modules. In that case, every problem would have its own dedicated processor, its own specialized machine, its own isolated domain. Yet a new difficulty immediately emerges. Who decides which module should be used? Where does overall judgment come from? Where is the system that determines which solution is best? A collection of isolated modules has no obvious answer. Each module knows only its own business. If this picture were correct, then many of my concerns about global cognition would disappear. But I do not believe the picture is correct. Indeed, I am not convinced that a completely modular mind is even possible, and there is remarkably little evidence that it exists. So before accepting the doctrine of massive modularity, we must examine its weaknesses much more carefully. Some theorists, most notably John Tooby and Leda Cosmides, argue that the human mind could only have evolved as a collection of specialized modules. According to them, a non-modular mind would never have survived. I find that conclusion difficult to accept. The structure of the mind is the product of many competing demands. Speed matters, accuracy matters, flexibility matters, adaptability matters. There is no obvious reason why evolution should favor only one type of cognitive architecture. Yet advocates of massive modularity remain confident. They insist that survival would have been impossible without specialized mental compartments. Let us examine the arguments that lead them to this conclusion. Different problems require different solutions. The first argument begins with a simple observation. Different activities require different standards of success. Hunting is not the same as raising children. Finding food is not the same as selecting a mate. Negotiating social relationships is not the same as avoiding predators. Each problem appears to demand its own kind of expertise. This raises an important question. Can a single, general-purpose cognitive system really handle all of these tasks? Imagine that someone learns a simple evolutionary truth. Reproduction is important for survival. Should that person spend every waking moment pursuing reproduction? Obviously not. Different goals become important under different circumstances. Tooby and Cosmides argue that only specialized modules can determine when a particular goal should be pursued and when it should be ignored. At first glance, this sounds persuasive, yet I remain unconvinced. Truth is useful everywhere. Accurate information contributes to success regardless of the domain in which it is applied. Of course, truth alone is not sufficient. To survive, we need food, shelter, muscles, hands, feet, and countless other resources. But that observation misses the point. The mind and body function together. The mind gathers information. The body acts upon it. There is no obvious reason why every challenge must require its own isolated cognitive machine. A general capacity for discovering truth may serve many purposes at once. Poverty of stimulus. The second argument concerns a famous problem known as the poverty of stimulus. Children receive surprisingly little information from their environment, yet they acquire an astonishing amount of knowledge. The conclusion, according to advocates of modularity, is that the mind must contain numerous specialized systems from birth. But this argument conflates two different ideas. Innateness is not the same thing as modularity. A person may be born with substantial cognitive structure without possessing separate informational compartments. The two claims are logically independent. Human beings may possess innate abilities without organizing them into isolated modules. Consider walking. Children are born with remarkable capacities that eventually enable them to walk. Yet walking is not obviously controlled by a sealed cognitive compartment. Innate knowledge does not automatically imply modular architecture. Combinatorial explosion. The third argument concerns what computer scientists call combinatorial explosion. The concern is straightforward. A general-purpose mind would face too many possibilities. Imagine standing before thousands of potential paths. Without constraints, reasoning would become impossibly slow. Supporters of modularity argue that specialized modules solve this problem by narrowing the search space. Each module examines only a limited range of possibilities. As a result, cognition becomes manageable. The argument has some force. But it is not the only possible solution. Perhaps the mind works in ways that transcend traditional computation. Perhaps its architecture solves the problem through mechanisms we do not yet understand. We should not assume that modularity is the only available answer, a difficulty for massive modularity. Let me offer an argument of my own. Suppose the mind contains two modules. One specializes in triangles. The other specializes in squares. Now imagine that an image appears before the mind. How does the system determine which module should process it? There seem to be only two possibilities. First possibility. A larger system stands above the modules. It examines the image and decides whether it belongs to the triangle module or the square module. But if such a system exists, then the mind is no longer completely modular. The supervisory system performs a general function. It oversees everything. That directly contradicts the doctrine of massive modularity. Second possibility. Suppose we create additional modules. One module recognizes triangles. Another recognizes squares. Now the original modules no longer require supervision. But a new question immediately appears. Who decides which recognition modules should be activated? We now require another supervisory system, and then another, and another. The process continues indefinitely. We find ourselves trapped in an infinite regress. It becomes a cognitive version of the classic chicken and egg problem. At some point, there must be a general mechanism capable of examining information before assigning it to specialized processors. And if such a mechanism exists, then a fully modular mind cannot be the entire story, the role of the senses. Earlier philosophers accepted a simple principle. Everything entering the mind must first pass through the senses. This idea is sometimes called the empiricist principle. Our sensory systems are remarkably open. They are domain general. They admit many different kinds of information. In effect, the senses act as gatekeepers. They determine which information enters the cognitive system and where it goes. In this respect, the senses function as the true entrance to the mind. Now imagine someone who accepts massive modularity but rejects the idea that all information enters through the senses. The situation becomes even more complicated. The cheater detection example. Consider the famous cheater detection module proposed by evolutionary psychologists. According to this theory, a specialized cognitive system becomes active whenever individuals engage in social exchange. When people trade, cooperate, negotiate, or make agreements, the module supposedly searches for signs of cheating. But an obvious question arises. How does the mind know that a social exchange is taking place? How does it recognize the situation in the first place? To identify a social exchange, another system must already understand what a social exchange is. And that recognition system would need to be even more sophisticated than the cheater detection module itself. Once again, the modular explanation seems to require a larger and more general cognitive mechanism. The problem returns immediately. The same problem appears in language. Language presents a similar challenge. How does the mind distinguish language from noise? How does it know when someone is speaking rather than simply producing sounds? Researchers have spent years searching for unique acoustic features that identify language. The search has produced no definitive solution. And the difficulty becomes even greater when we consider sign languages. Sign languages contain no sound at all, yet the mind recognizes them as language instantly. Why? Because recognizing language requires more than detecting sensory patterns. It requires interpretation. It requires understanding. It requires a broader cognitive perspective. The central lesson. Identifying objects, situations, and meanings, and assigning them to the appropriate cognitive systems, is itself an extraordinarily sophisticated task. It demands reasoning. It demands interpretation. And above all, it demands global cognition. This is precisely the kind of activity that informationally closed modules struggle to explain. Without some form of global cognition, the modules become ineffective. For that reason, the modular story remains incomplete. Up to this point, the modern synthesis has rested upon two central assumptions. First, the mind functions like a computer. Second, the mind is divided into specialized modules. Computers excel at local processing. Modules create local environments. Together, they appear to offer an elegant explanation of cognition. But the modern synthesis contains a third and even more ambitious claim. It argues that the mind itself is an adaptation produced by evolution, and that is where we must turn next. The evolutionary story is, in many ways, the most ambitious part of the entire theory. Unfortunately, it is also the part that raises some of the most difficult questions. We now arrive at the third major claim of the modern synthesis. The mind is an adaptation produced by evolution. Supporters of this view often begin with a simple demand. Any adequate theory of the mind, they argue, must be consistent with evolutionary biology. If a theory cannot be reconciled with Darwinian principles, then something must be wrong with it. This requirement is often presented as a matter of scientific consistency. At first glance, that sounds entirely reasonable. Yet I believe the argument is much weaker than it appears. The problem with consistency. The first questionable assumption is the appeal to consistency itself. Many people assume that every branch of science must fit neatly into every other branch of science. If one theory does not immediately explain another, something must be missing. But that assumption deserves closer scrutiny. Understanding how something works is not always the same as understanding how it came into existence. Suppose you want to understand how birds fly. You study aerodynamics. You investigate lift, drag, wing structure, and air pressure. None of this requires detailed knowledge of the evolutionary history of birds. The mechanism and the history are different questions. The same distinction applies to the mind. One question asks, how does the mind work? Another asks, how did the mind evolve? These questions are related, but they are not identical. Answering one does not automatically answer the other. Different sciences often investigate different kinds of problems. Astronomy studies stars. Botany studies plants. Both disciplines are perfectly legitimate. Both describe real phenomena, yet neither depends upon the other. No one believes that an adequate theory of plants must first be derived from astronomy. Likewise, it may be entirely possible to develop a theory of cognition without first deriving it from evolutionary biology. The modern synthesis often assumes that biology must explain everything. But scientific relationships are rarely so straightforward. Saying that all sciences must fit together is easy. Demonstrating exactly how they fit together is much harder. The mind's evolutionary history and its present-day operation may turn out to be largely separate stories. There is no reason to assume otherwise. The question of function. The second argument concerns function. Both biology and psychology frequently ask questions about purpose. What is the heart for? What are eyes for? What is the mind for? Many theorists argue that such questions can only be answered through evolution. According to this view, the function of a trait is whatever natural selection designed it to do. If we want to understand the mind, we must first understand its evolutionary history. I find this argument unpersuasive. Evolutionary history may explain why a structure exists, but that does not mean it is the only way to understand what the structure does. Consider the heart. The heart pumps blood. Imagine, for a moment, that Darwin's theory were somehow disproven tomorrow. Would the heart stop pumping blood? Of course not. Its function would remain exactly the same. We know what the heart does because we can observe it directly. The same is true of the eye. Eyes are for seeing. People understood that long before evolutionary theory existed. Physicians successfully identified the functions of organs centuries before Darwin. The situation is no different when we examine human artifacts. Consider an airplane wing. We understand its purpose by observing how it works. We do not need to reconstruct its entire developmental history before understanding its function. In practice, we usually proceed in the opposite direction. First, we determine what something does. Only afterward do we speculate about how it came to exist. Present function is relatively accessible. Ancient history is far more difficult to reconstruct. The deeper we move into the past, the more uncertain our conclusions become. For this reason, I do not believe evolutionary explanations possess a monopoly on questions of function, the argument from complexity. A third argument concerns complexity. Advocates of evolutionary psychology often point out that the human mind is extraordinarily complex. From this observation, they draw a conclusion. Complex systems, they argue, require gradual evolutionary construction. Natural selection must therefore be responsible for the intricate architecture of the mind. The conclusion does not follow as easily as they suppose. Complexity alone proves very little. The real question is not whether the mind is complex. The real question is how much biological change was required to produce that complexity. And that is something we simply do not know. Our understanding of the relationship between brains and minds remains limited. We know surprisingly little about how neural activity produces cognition. As a result, it is entirely possible that relatively small biological changes generated enormous cognitive consequences. Consider the difference between humans and other primates. Physically, our brains are remarkably similar. Yet the cognitive gap is immense. A relatively modest neurological modification may have produced a dramatic transformation in mental ability. If that is true, then the standard picture of countless tiny improvements becomes much less compelling. Complexity does not automatically imply gradual accumulation. Sometimes small causes produce enormous effects. The giraffe and the mind. Darwinian explanations are most persuasive when small changes yield small advantages. The classic example is the giraffe. A slightly longer neck allows access to slightly higher leaves. That advantage increases survival and reproduction. Over many generations, these small benefits accumulate. The neck gradually becomes longer. The explanation is elegant and convincing. But does the same logic apply to cognition? That remains unclear. We still do not understand how neural structures generate thought. A tiny change in the brain may produce a disproportionately large change in cognition. Human intelligence may have emerged through precisely such a transformation. Computer science offers an illuminating analogy. A very small change in a computer program can radically alter what the system is capable of doing. The hardware remains largely unchanged. Yet the behavior of the system becomes dramatically different. Perhaps minds work in a similar way. If cognitive systems are deeply interconnected, then a minor modification could transform the entire architecture. In that case, mental evolution may not resemble the gradual accumulation of tiny improvements at all. Why evolution matters to modularity. At this point, an important question arises. Why are advocates of massive modularity so committed to Darwinian explanations? The answer is surprisingly straightforward. Every proposed module contains information. Each module is supposed to function as a built-in database. Naturally, we want to know where that information came from. Classical rationalists such as Descartes believed that innate knowledge resembled mathematics. Statements such as 2 + 2 = 4 appear universally true. Modern evolutionary psychologists often propose something different. They argue that many modules contain information about the specific environment in which human beings evolved. For example, objects tend to remain where they are placed. Falling from great heights is dangerous. Certain regularities in the environment can be trusted. These are not universal truths about every conceivable world. They are truths about our particular world. So how could the mind know them in advance? For the modular theorist, there is only one obvious answer: natural selection. The environment shaped the mind across countless generations. Evolution filled the modules with useful information. The mind became adapted to the world in which it developed. This is why modularity and Darwinism are so closely connected. Without evolution, explaining the contents of the modules becomes extremely difficult. The telephone directory thought experiment. Imagine tearing apart a telephone directory. Now mix all the names and telephone numbers together. Finally, pair them randomly. Would you expect every name to end up matched with the correct number? Of course not. Correct pairings would occur only by accident. The same principle applies to cognition. The vast collection of information supposedly contained within mental modules cannot simply appear by chance. Something must explain the match between mind and world. For evolutionary psychologists, natural selection serves as that explanation. Evolution becomes the teacher. Across generations, it fills the mind with information that helps organisms survive and reproduce. The special case of language. Language occupies an unusual position in this debate. Like other cognitive capacities, it is often described as innate. But its relationship to Darwinian adaptation appears far less direct. Most proposed modules contain information about the external environment. Language is different. Language is fundamentally concerned with communication between minds. If you and I belong to the same species, our linguistic systems will already share important similarities. To understand your language, I do not necessarily need detailed information about the environment. I need a mind sufficiently similar to yours. This is one reason Chomsky often resists adaptationist explanations of language. Language may be innate without being a specialized evolutionary adaptation in the usual sense, the real cognitive revolution. If one accepts massive modularity, Darwinian explanations become almost unavoidable. Without evolution, it becomes difficult to explain how so many modules acquired their information. But throughout this discussion, I have argued that the mind is not simply a collection of isolated compartments. Human beings possess something more. We engage in global reasoning. We integrate information from many different sources. We solve problems that require broad coordination across multiple domains of knowledge. The difference between humans and apes cannot be explained merely by the accumulation of additional facts. The deeper difference lies in the way cognition itself is organized. At some point in evolutionary history, a profound transformation occurred. A new style of thinking emerged. A system capable of integrating information across domains appeared. That transformation changed everything. And it is that transformation, not merely the storage of information, that ultimately explains what makes human cognition unique. Let us now step back and consider the larger picture. Throughout this book, we have examined several influential ideas about the mind. We began with the computational theory of mind, the proposal that thinking is a form of computation. We then considered the role of innate knowledge, the importance of syntax, the appeal of modularity, and the promises of evolutionary psychology. Each of these ideas contains an important insight. None of them, however, tells the whole story. The central lesson is simple. Much of human cognition resembles problem solving. And genuine problem solving cannot be reduced to isolated modules operating independently of one another. Modules work within restricted domains. They process limited kinds of information. They perform local tasks. Human intelligence often requires something far more ambitious. It requires the ability to integrate information drawn from many different sources. It requires access to the broader cognitive system. It requires what I have called global cognition. This distinction is crucial. Syntax concerns the internal structure of thoughts. It describes the arrangement of symbols within mental representations. Because syntax deals with internal structure, it is fundamentally local. Global cognition operates at a different level altogether. Rather than examining individual representations, it examines relationships among representations. It evaluates how beliefs fit together. It determines which information is relevant and which information can be ignored. It weighs competing considerations. It decides what matters. In short, it looks beyond individual thoughts and considers the larger system to which those thoughts belong. This is why syntax and global cognition cannot be identified with one another. The syntax of a thought remains stable. Context changes. The importance of a belief changes. Its relevance changes. Its relationship to other beliefs changes. But the internal structure of the representation remains the same. Human beings constantly navigate these changing relationships. We revise our beliefs. We reinterpret information. We abandon assumptions. We discover new connections. We recognize that facts which once seemed important may later become irrelevant. And we recognize that ideas once considered insignificant may suddenly become central. None of this can be explained solely by reference to local syntax. Something larger is taking place. Perhaps global cognition is still mechanical in some deeper sense. Perhaps future discoveries will reveal principles that allow us to understand it scientifically. I do not deny that possibility. What I deny is the claim that existing computational theories have already solved the problem. They have not. Traditional computational models are designed to manipulate symbols according to formal rules. Within their proper domain, they work remarkably well. They explain many aspects of cognition. They illuminate important features of mental life. But they do not explain everything. Most importantly, they do not explain how minds determine relevance, importance, and context. Those questions remain largely unanswered. For many decades, cognitive science has concentrated its efforts on syntax and computation. That focus has been productive. We have learned a great deal. Yet it has also encouraged us to overlook some of the most remarkable features of human intelligence. The greatest challenge is not understanding local computation. The greatest challenge is understanding global cognition. That is where the deepest mysteries remain. That is where our theories remain weakest. And that is where future progress must occur. Perhaps one day a new framework will emerge. Perhaps we will discover a theory capable of uniting local computation with global reasoning. Perhaps we will finally understand how context, relevance, and large-scale cognition fit together. At present, however, no such theory exists. We know that syntax matters. We know that computation matters. We know that innate structure matters. But we also know that none of these ideas, taken individually, can fully explain the human mind. The mind is more complex than our current theories suggest, and that is the most important conclusion of all. The mind is not merely a collection of symbols. It is not merely a computer. It is not merely a set of modules. Something larger is at work. Until we understand that larger process, our science of the mind will remain incomplete. That concludes today's exploration. We'll return soon with another Audivoo episode, another book, and another journey into ideas. Thank you for listening.